So this is my FX9 video, but it's going to be a little different from my regular in-depth reviews because with everything on lockdown and no projects to field test this thing on, I can only provide a limited perspective. But what I can do is test the new features that make the FX9 different and discuss some usability aspects that still need improvement. Let's get undone. Gerald Undone. He's crazy. What's happening, everybody? I'm Gerald Undone, and I have an all-day battery, but only an 8GB SD card. So the three things I was most excited about on the Sony PXW-FX9 was the automatic variable ND, the autofocus, and the ability to process gyroscopic data into a stabilized image. And perhaps a little extra excitement for the foreshadowed RAW capabilities with a future firmware update. But let's start with the one that impressed me the most, the automatic variable ND. Sony got everything right with this feature, and it's something that immediately spoils you and makes you wish every camera had it. Like other cameras with built-in ND, you can deploy it at fixed stop densities, with 2 stops being the minimum, but once it's deployed, you can also choose to smoothly increase the density with the dial, allowing for much finer adjustments. Or most impressively, you can enable the auto function, which will then make those adjustments for you anywhere between 2 stops and 7 stops. And if you don't want ND anymore, you can clear it, which replaces the filter with a clear piece of glass over the sensor to keep the stack depth the same and prevent any possible back focus issues that people have complained about on the FS5 and FS7. I have a fun test here to show you where I had Julie walk backwards holding a color checker to see how well it maintained middle gray. I'll put a waveform up on the screen as well so you can see where the bars fall as we move through sun and shade. I'm also using the 2 other functions I mentioned in the shot, the face detection autofocus, and it's stabilized in post with the gyro data. The autofocus worked great, but everything else was on manual, so the ISO, f-stop, and shutter angle all remained fixed. Only the ND was changing. I think it did a fantastic job. At the end of the sequence, you can see the temperature change as the sun went away, and this aspect could be remedied by enabling auto white balance as well, but I left that off to get a more accurate result for exposure consistency. I also tested it going from extreme dark to light by rapidly changing the output of my light from 1% to 50% and back again, and the auto ND was able to keep up surprisingly well. Next up, let's talk autofocus, which is mostly fantastic as well, but does have one issue that I want to point out. Now, if you want an extremely thorough evaluation of the FX9's autofocus performance, I would highly recommend you watch the epic saga that is Philip Bloom's review on the FX9. But for me, I'll keep it short and simple and just say it worked really, really well. It's a Sony, and it's bringing their reliable video AF from their mirrorless camera line in this style of body. I did a 2-hour live stream in face priority mode, and the focus didn't hesitate or do anything unpredictable for a single frame. And the other option, the face only mode, is a great feature for preventing focus hunting when your subject leaves the frame and comes back frequently. It just switches over to manual when it loses the face and starts tracking again when you return. This has a lot of practical applications and is extremely useful. And Sony has one of, if not the only autofocus system on the market that you can truly rely on for critical work. However, there is one issue with the face detection, and that is it doesn't work if you overexpose. This is more of an issue in the Cine EI mode because of the way the processing chain works. You're shooting an S-Log3, which is extremely flat, and any kind of gamma view assist or monitoring LUT takes place after the autofocus analysis. So the AF only ever sees the flat image, so when you overexpose, the face detection just disappears. It doesn't do this on the mirrorless lineup, and I'm not talking about a crazy amount of overexposure here either. Even 1 stop over and you'll lose face detection in many scenes. Now, just to preempt the questions of why I would choose to overexpose on this camera, it's to get better noise performance. Admittedly, this is Sony's cleanest camera to date in this form factor, and the noise isn't all that bad even if you expose to the recommended 41% middle gray, but overexposing by just 1 stop does still make a considerable difference in the amount of noise you see once you correct for that with curves and post. And it's the way I like to shoot when there aren't as many highlights to protect, and one of the advantages of using a log profile. But you just can't do it if face detection autofocus is important to you as well, which is kind of a bummer, because that face detection would be one of the main reasons for getting this camera over some of the cheaper PXW alternatives. Autofocus still works when overexposed, and it's still very reliable, you just lose those extra options I mentioned earlier that require detecting a face. So you're left with a more generalized, center-weighted, distance-based autofocus. Unless you have the camera in face-only mode, then not detecting a face will effectively leave the camera in manual focus. Now in custom mode, it's less of a problem, probably again due to the processing chain and the increased contrast. But overexposure in custom mode is less useful anyway, one, because the noise performance in S-Cinetone is great to begin with, but also because there's less dynamic range to overexpose with. Now I've heard there's an autofocus firmware update inbound, so maybe that will help address this, but if not, this is something I'd like to see fixed. And speaking of S-Cinetone, by the way, it's a great profile. When I heard that it was designed to be more pleasing and less accurate, I was expecting to see a pretty wacky vector scope. but I'm happy to report that they've struck a really nice balance with this one between pleasing skin tones and decent dynamic range, while keeping a very respectable level of color accuracy on the vector scope. I'd only use it when I needed to have something delivery ready right away, like in my live streaming scenario, or if you're extremely uncomfortable with grading log, but regardless, I'd say it ranks in my top 3 Rec. 709 profiles on any system. Now before we move on to the things this camera didn't do so well, let me just give a thumbs up to the preamps because they're great. Here's a sound sample comparison of the FX9 recording my Octava MK12, which is placed just out of frame and connected over XLR using phantom power. I've got the gain dial set to about 8.5 on the FX9, and then we can compare it to my regular setup of running it instead to the Zoom F6. Following his accidental exposure to gamma rays, Banner is physically transformed into the Hulk when subjected to emotional stress at or against his will, often leading to destructive rampages and conflicts that complicate Banner's civilian life. Following his accidental exposure to gamma rays, Banner is physically transformed into the Hulk when subjected to emotional stress at or against his will, often leading to destructive rampages and conflicts that complicate Banner's civilian life. Okay, so the third thing I mentioned I was excited for was the ability to post-stabilize your footage. Unfortunately, this was not a very rewarding experience. First off, it takes way too long. You have to run your shots through Sony's Catalyst Browse software, and one at a time you have to choose between auto or manual. Auto seems to set the crop to around 15% for the stabilization, and manual lets you adjust the amount with a slider. I found you need at least 5% in order to eliminate any instances of the frame extremities creeping into your shot in the form of black lines. But even 5% does make a noticeable improvement over no stabilization. But 15% is markedly better still. You can have multiple exports queued in Catalyst Browse, but they're done one at a time, and there's no way I could find to batch process a bunch of clips. And the software doesn't seem to be optimized to take advantage of a beefy computer. I was only using 30% of my CPU and none of my GPU to stabilize, and it took around a 10 times multiple of your clip duration, so a 90-second clip took me 15 minutes to export. Now, it does certainly look better, but there's other considerations to be made. First off, since it's stabilization done in post, it doesn't remove the impact of an overzealous footstep. For this follow shot, I specifically stomped around like a bozo to create a case for needing stabilization. And the problem is the damage is already done. When the foot drops, the sensor gets shocked vertically and objects in the frame have a directional blur to them, which of course isn't removed by Catalyst Browse. So what you're left with is a significantly more stable, but softer, blurrier shot that's now 15% cropped in and subject to diminished quality and increased artifacts due to re-encoding. Only now, the blur seems out of place because you no longer see the frame move, so objects just randomly blur as if the focus was hunting. I didn't find it particularly pleasing. To make matters worse, the stabilize function built into DaVinci Resolve was not only incomparably faster, I think it took me 6 seconds versus 15 minutes in Catalyst Browse, but it actually did a better job without the need to round-trip footage. It also achieved those results with a lesser crop and no diminished quality, and in fact, the directional blur issue was mitigated a bit as well. Now, I've seen some comparisons where the Catalyst Browse version does perform favorably against Premiere's Warp Stabilizer, but it's no match for Resolve. Of course, the other question is, how smooth is it comparatively? Well, here it is against the Panasonic S1H's dual IS, using both a stabilized lens and body on the Panasonic, featuring one of the best IBIS systems on the market. I'd say the 5% is similar to what you'd get from a quality IBIS, but the 15% is noticeably better. However, the IBIS doesn't have that softness issue because the sensor is actually being stabilized, so the footsteps aren't impacting the sensor and the recordings as much versus being recorded and then smoothed out in post. But IBIS doesn't have that floaty feeling because with really good IBIS, you generally have to fight against it a little bit to make any camera movements, so there's pros and cons. The only no compromises approach is to use a camera with a weaker IBIS, like the A7 III, and throw it on a gimbal. Then you've got the sensor stabilization to help remove any bad footsteps, and the gimbal to give you smooth flight, without too much resistance from the in-body stabilization, which is why I said have a little bit of a weaker one, but a stabilized lens can also help accomplish this too. And then you'll have a final image that's much more pleasing than anything you can do in post. Two more somewhat minor things that annoyed me while using this camera. First, the white balance tool. I'd really like to see a resizable reticle for white balance capture. The zone on the FX9 is quite large and can overshoot by hundreds of Kelvin if the white balance card doesn't fully fit the target box. And unless you have a huge reach on your zoom lens, this is going to pose a problem if you like to capture custom white balances. I want to see more companies adding the ability to adjust the size of this box like we've seen Fuji do recently. Secondly, this viewfinder loupe needs a revamp when it comes to these clamps. This has been an ongoing problem on previous Sony cameras. It just takes way too little force to completely pop off the loupe. Make this buckle better already. I also have a complaint about the frame rate options and the frame rate switching. I know that some of this is being addressed in firmware, but there's no 60p in full frame 4K right now. It's supposed to be coming soon, but this should have been a launch item. And I'm hearing now that it's possible that it'll be a 1.2 times crop when it does come with the firmware update, which I don't think is completely acceptable in 2020 with a camera of this size and price. Hopefully that information is incorrect and it's a proper full frame readout in 60p. Because it's already a bit burdensome to change frame rates on this camera. You have to go into a specific menu for it, and then the camera needs to reboot after executing the change. It would be even worse if you then had to reframe or change lenses due to an added crop. Blackmagic has kind of spoiled me here, how you can easily just adjust frame rates with a slider without any lag or frame changes. I would have loved to see something even remotely similar to that on the FX9. Moving on, my bonus fourth thing that I was excited about is something I've quickly lost interest in due to it being unwieldy and cost prohibitive, and that's the raw video output. It's not out yet, so perhaps things could change, but right now it's suggested that you'll need this XDCA extension unit, which is absurd in both size and price. You guys are always making jokes about how I make things look small in my hands. Well, this thing is as big as my head, and it makes an already large camera like the FX9 absurdly long. And it's $2,500. Now it does offer support for more connectivity and wireless options, it takes V-mount batteries, and will eventually give raw video output, but at 5 times the price of some competing battery adapter plates, that's a steep price to pay for raw. But it gets worse when you factor in that right now, the only devices listed to support that raw output are Atomos's Neon lineup, which start at $4,000 for their smallest 17-inch offering, which means it wouldn't be camera mountable anyway unless they make a smaller Neon or expand it to the existing lineup of Ninjas and or Shoguns. So as it currently stands, for most shooters, paying an extra $6,500 for RAW out to a 17-inch monitor and making your E&G camera feel like you've got an Alexa on your shoulder is not ideal. And that's where the cons are going to stop, because luckily, RAW is quite unnecessary to get a fantastic image out of this camera. The 10-bit 422 S-Log3 on this camera is terrific, and this is where it really differentiates itself from Sony's mirrorless lineup. Just looking at a simple blue sky is a bit of a tell-all. On the FX9, I can shoot this bright sky at f4, and the variable ND will kick up to 7 stops with no vignetting and no color shift. The clouds are smooth shades of gray, and the sky has no banding in it whatsoever, and the color resolution is tight with a nice spread across the frame. You might see banding on YouTube, but that's a YouTube thing. This image is flawless on my screen. However, if I take the same shot with the A7 III and use a variable ND to achieve the same exposure at f4, we get this. Significant vignetting and a noticeable color shift. And I'm using a top-of-the-line variable ND here, which compared to others looks fantastic, but still not near as good as the FX9's built-in VND. To get similar results on the A7 III, I'd have to bust out the matte box and use fixed plates. But that still wouldn't fix the color resolution or bit depth problems. Look what happens to the sky and clouds when we zoom in. On the A7 III, there's blotches of purple and green swirling together, and significantly more banding. The banding is a 10-bit versus 8-bit problem, and colors not meeting each other well is worsened by the A7 III's 420 subsampling. You can see this exaggerated if we crank the contrast way up. On the A7 III, I was shooting S-Log2, by the way. I could have used S-Log3 to match, but that would have performed even worse. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that the A7 III is unusable. It's a fantastic camera, and I shoot tons of video with it. It just doesn't really compare to the FX9 for image quality or dynamic range. But how important this is and how much of a dollar value you'd assign to that is up to you. But I can say that if you're shooting at 24p and following the exposure guidelines, so 41% middle gray, and shooting Cine EI with S-Log3, S-Gamma 3 Cine, you can pop on a free LUT from Sony that, thanks to the impressive dynamic range and color quality in this camera, will give you an image that's dangerously close to the Sony Venice. But with reliable face detection autofocus and a terrific automatic variable ND. And for $11,000, that's a pretty impressive feat. But that's going to be it for me. I hope you found this video entertaining, or at least helpful, and if you did, make sure you leave it the old thumbs up and consider subscribing if you haven't already. But if you did not find this video helpful or entertaining, try setting the playback speed to 75%. Alright, I'm done.